So thank you very much for attending. And I think what's going to be interesting in the way the presentation comes out is that obviously I prepared this work, and then listening to everybody over the last 2 days, so many thoughts are going through my head, and I've learned so much from all of you. So perhaps some of those ideas are going to weave through the way that I'm going to reflect on the report. But just to add to the introduction, I'm a geographer and I also studied mathematics. I'm a big fan of universities. I think that what going through the process of being in a university is that we really develop deep engagement with knowledge. And I think that's one of the responsibilities of those of us that are in universities, the privilege of being in a university, either as an academic or as a student, is that you realize that what you're really focusing on is knowledge and the power of knowledge. And I think from a university perspective, and I'll try and show that in my presentation, I think we have this enormous responsibility to be intermediaries who are able to translate knowledge and move knowledge in different ways. And I think that's a lot of what the science engagement work is about. Of course, when we have trained in a university, I think one of the things that we really gain is that you start to understand, and maybe you only see it after many years, and when you get older, you look backwards on your career. And I was talking to Suzanne about this earlier. She's a political scientist, and yet she's commenting on this work. And what you start to realize is that the scientific processes or knowledge that you've developed over time and through your learning in university becomes the way that you're almost wired to see the world. It's your lens on the world, and somebody else will have a different lens. And so I think when you study in a university and you study for long periods of time, what you might think is that you're looking at the outputs or the products of your work, but what's really happening is that there's a changing in the way that you're thinking. There's almost a rewiring of your brain. There's a way that you approach knowledge and questions and problems that's going to be shaped by the discipline or the field that you've studied in. It's going to give you a lens on the world. And I think what we need to think of in the science engagement work that we want to do to try and improve excitement and inspiration of science in our country is that we need to think about how do we translate this kind of creation of a knowledge space that we develop through our university lives into the kinds of spaces that we bring other citizens in. So this is not in my presentation, but you've kind of all inspired me to think about that over the last 2 days, that maybe that's our real role and responsibility as those of us that are in universities or students in universities. How do we take what we are learning about ourselves and how we're changing because we're in a knowledge space and use that to inspire others in the science engagement spaces we create? How do we meet them in those spaces and inspire them? So there are 3 things that I really needed to do with this work. One, I need to present the chapter on science engagement through the activities that are there and the behaviours that we see. So I'll present some of the outcomes of the report. I think it's also important to remember that this is a baseline report and it's going to be done in another 5 years' time. Is that correct? And so I think we also need to reflect on what kinds of questions should we ask in the next report. Obviously, in a baseline report, you want to ask the same kind of questions because it's a longitudinal study. But I think there are also learnings when you reflect on, and this is an excellent piece of work, when you reflect on the excellence in this work, what could we add to or extend this work so that we ask other kinds of questions? Because we all know as researchers, as soon as you've finished a survey and you've got all your data, the first thing you're saying to yourself, why didn't I ask that question? Why did I not think about that? So in a way, we're reflecting also on what we could add or change to this baseline. And then what I want to do is try and reflect on this study, which is a big quantitative study of 6,100 citizens across the country, amazing data set, but it's a quantitative study and it's done using methodologies where people are responding to very closed-ended and quantitative type questions. And just using my small experience of my work in Durban, I thought this is so interesting to read this report and let me see how it reflects with the on-the-ground work that I'm doing in Durban, where I'm engaging with scientists in lots of different contexts. And is that the same? Are there disjunctures between what this says and what I see? Or are there commonalities? And maybe that's where we can ask some of these questions. So that's really what I'm going to try and do in my approach to the report. So on the next slide, sorry, I must just get used to these two buttons. What was interesting for me was that the way in which the academics and researchers who produced this report decided to look at activities and behaviours in a number of ways. One, they looked at school science, and they certainly in the reports focused on STEM, obviously the science and maths subjects and biology, and brought in the social sciences. So that was an emphasis of theirs, and I think that's very important. But in discussing this work with Sylvia Hannon, she was making the comment that it was very interesting that the minute you ask people about science, and you can see it in the word clouds for this report, people automatically reflect on science as being the natural sciences, the engineering sciences, the technical sciences. So I think there's work to be done in the country about what science actually means. So that was the first interesting part. The second, what I found really interesting, is they looked at knowledge sharing activities. And I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to talk about how important people are in this equation, because we've heard a lot about online and internet information, but I see something interesting in the results that might support ways that we can go forward. Obviously the online AMPs, we've had a lot of presentation on that. Community-based engagement, which you'll see that's quite a big focus of my presentation, and it's my own bias because that's what I work on. So I apologize for that, but I'm going to try and see how you respond to what I show you. And then this very interesting thing of attraction-based events, and I've got a little vignette to tell you about that. So science is really defined as knowledge produced in the academic disciplines. This is from the report, and we see this broad range of ways that we speak about science, and I think it's very positive that we include the humanities and the arts in the way we define science. But we also find that science is produced in society, and I think part of what we're grappling with is we're trying to produce a program to build more science engagement and more science knowledge in our country. But what we need to recognize is that science is being produced everywhere all the time as we battle against the kinds of challenges we face. So perhaps it's not so much about the science being produced, but how do we create that science? How do we integrate that science and bring that knowledge together so we can really affect the change we want to see in our country? So I think that's about how do we build this relationship between science and society through the activities, so that's the emphasis of my presentation, through the activities we create so that can translate into changed behavior. And so I've said we're going to broaden the view of science, and I'm going to try and reflect on some of the barriers and enablers to that. So if you look at the report and the results in science engagements, which is my theme, what I found fascinating, and I really must commend the research team on bringing in the idea of environmental concern as a lens or an analytical angle to actually reflect on the power of science. And I think that might be the key in our country, and it might be my bias because obviously I work on environmental work, but in all of my research, South Africans have a very high level of environmental consciousness and concern. And that might be the way that we enter this point, but you can think about that and I'll present that at the end. What we do see again is a strong interest in science and technology. People value science and technology knowledge. And then when we look at the reality of science engagements through the themes used, what we see is that there are reasonable levels of basic science education. I must say, I was quite surprised that the levels of STEM education were as high as they were. I thought they would be lower. Not to say that there's quality in that form of education, but I was quite positively surprised by those levels. We see a low use of online apps for science, and we heard the previous speakers talking about that. What we see is also some low levels of knowledge sharing and then very low engagement in these events-based activities, and you can see that in the data. The lowest percentages are actually in the science engagement. So I'm presenting a part of the work that's actually representing the lowest kind of interaction. We do see quite a range of variability, particularly in terms of exposure to school science, and then, of course, also in terms of use of online apps. But the important ones, community-based engagement and information sharing, actually there isn't, even though they're low percentages, there isn't a huge diversity in range. And I think that's perhaps where we can look at some opportunity for change. So I think we do need to change the narrative about how we characterize and describe the South African public, because I think we have assumptions about who knows science, who's engaged in science, and who's interested in science. And while we have to improve science education at school, I think we have to change the way we think about scientific learning post-school and try and develop an ongoing program of teaching and learning so that people continue to engage in the science that they produce at the societal level, but also with the science that's produced by by scholars or the academia. What's worrying to me is that while we have these high levels of interest and knowledge, so motivation and inspiration to engage in science, we see low levels of engagement in the kinds of activities and actions and impact we create. And it might be the way that the survey asked the questions, and I think there is in part that problem, because we're asking about very specific types of ways that we framed activities. But it also means that maybe those activities are not meeting that interest in science. And of course, we know in South Africa there are a lot of structural factors that need to be addressed to try and change engagement in activities. So how do we think about the kinds of activities? What kinds of activities are you thinking about? And behaviours that we can be part of, that we can design and support. And I'm saying here as the public of South Africa, as all of us, not the government or the DSTI or the HSRC or universities, all of us as a public, the state, private sector, civil society, citizens, how do we grow this interest in science and knowledge about science and technology? How do we commit as a country as a whole? And I mean, I think the sport example was interesting because, boy, if our teams are playing, we all get behind them. There's no question about that. So we know that if we can create this idea that the public is all responsible for our collective education and knowledge in science, we might start to see real significant change in how people engage in these activities. So I'm going to take you to an example where, again, I was taught from people on the ground about how we need to think about the world of science and scientific knowledge. And this was a project that I worked on. The Gates Foundation used Durban as the case test study site for all the global innovation in non-sewage sanitation technology. So all the tech developers around the world came and tested their sanitation technologies in Durban in real-world contexts. And what was absolutely astounding to me, we had this water wall, which you can see on the right-hand side there. The community actually called it the ATM. You can see why they called it the ATM. And it's a recycling hand-washing station. So the water is recycled within that machine and people could wash their hands. So we were going to test it in an informal settlement I work in. And this same hand-washing station was tested in a park in Zurich. And my responsibility was to get social responses to this new piece of technology. And the engineers from Switzerland flew out and we were engaging with the community. And our assumption would be that the communities in Zurich would probably ask all the correct science questions about how this water wall works, what is its technology, what does it do, how safe is it? Would that be your assumption? Or would you think that the community in Quarry Road West would ask the most pertinent scientific questions about that technology? What would you say? You're not sure now? Okay. Right. So what was really interesting was that in Zurich, when they did this assessment, people asked very few scientific questions about this technology and how it worked. They trusted the government completely. They trusted the scientists who put there. They went and used it every day. They assumed the water was safe, and they weren't worried about how the membranes were treating that water. As soon as we were introducing this technology into the informal settlement, we had to have 3 different events with the engineers before it even came there, because the community had so many scientific and engineering questions for the engineers before they allowed them to put that in their community. So they were thinking about the science, that the engineers, they were asking scientific questions about when does it switch off if something goes wrong? What happens if it breaks? What happens if other materials go into there? They wanted to know how the membrane worked. And so for me, this was a lesson about the science that exists in communities, the scientific knowledge, because they were going to ask multiple questions. And maybe it was, like we've seen in the data, a lack of trust in science. You brought that up, much greater questions. Not to say that the perspectives, I loved your graph that you showed, Suzanne, that actually it's not the promise or perspective of science. I can't remember, there's so many words we've used. But remember, you showed us the graph with the blue and the orange. I think that we're not negating science. We just we question everything in this country. And that's what we should harness, because we're a questioning society, because we don't trust many things, and how lucky we are that we don't. And it's not a negative thing, it's actually a positive thing, because isn't that what science is all about? And so I realized that from this example. Here's some more examples of the same projects where we were testing other technologies in other informal settlements. And here the science came to where people lived. Communities came to the university, and we engaged about, again, how this non-sewage sanitation technology was going to work. Communities were designing the spaces in which this technology would fit best so that it could address the local conditions. And this picture over here to me was amazing, because what the community did there, they wanted the councillor to come and address their concerns in Banana City informal settlement, and they could never get the councillor there. So when we had the science engagement, they invited the councillor to the science engagement. We all had the science engagement, and then they told us to leave and said, we want to speak to the councillor now. So they actually used the science for politics. That's real engagement in science. Okay, how do we get our councillor to come here and listen to us? Yes, we're going to use science to get the councillor there. So these are just examples of how I've seen science in action in the ground, and we often don't see that. And yet communities are seeing that all the time. They're using that, they're navigating how they can use science for the improvement of their lives. There's other work that we're doing on understanding and scaling climate science. And this is around early flood warning systems. So we have a community-based early flood warning system in Durban that we're trying to develop and scale up. And while this is a busy slide, what I wanted to show you is that there's a lot of scientific knowledge in all those blue boxes running down that we have to try and interpret and access if we want our very localized community-based flood warning system to work. And you can see the river gauges from this particular catchment. That's the river where we have to do the early warnings. It's the Palmeet River. We get the source data. So we're engaging with all these different forms of knowledge. And what I've learned, and it's actually in one of the IPCC papers recently, is that what's becoming increasingly important in us dealing with disaster risk reduction is that evidence-based experiential knowledge is becoming critical for how we translate all of this big science data on climate science into reality. And the evidence-based experiential knowledge is on the ground with communities, and when we work with them as university researchers or the municipality as we do in Durban, collectively we are building up this evidence base of science from experiential knowledge. But we're not necessarily calling that science engagement or scientific knowledge, and yet that's what it is. It's sitting there in these spaces. And then the last example I want to talk about is, this is a rehabilitation of a hole that was washed out by the floods in 2022. And what we're doing here is we're working with scientific and indigenous knowledge, because these community members all come from rural farms in the Eastern Cape. They live in informal settlements in the city. They have their knowledge about how best to do planting. They've done training courses within the municipality on making compost and planting trees, because we're trying to plant trees to protect against the floods and to reduce heat. And so now we're bringing these two forms of knowledge together, and we're going to create posters in the community where you can work with the scientific knowledge and the indigenous knowledge and bring those two together. But again, what's most important here, and I'm so glad we've had our lightning expert who's been in my group so actively over the last few days, talking about how we deal with trauma when we're dealing with disaster and flooding. And so we're actually using science and this communication across these two different forms of knowledge to address the trauma and the healing that's required after this hole was washed out over the floods. So again, science is interacting with psychology, trauma, healing, moving forward. And we're trying to think about how do we use the science and the healing that takes place to communicate this to other settlements in the city. So for me, these are the kinds of forms of scientific engagement that I see in my small-scale, localized work in Durban. And I'm trying to think about how does this fit with this big-scale, amazing research that's been done, and how can we reflect on these two data sets and think about it. So that brings me to this slide, because in the report, I found it so interesting how the report played off these ideas of knowledge, interest, and concern. And that's why I've put them in different ways. Like, what comes first? Is it interest, then knowledge, then concern? Or is it concern, and then interest, and then you go and find the knowledge. Because that's, I suppose, what's the motivation for people in a way. And what I would think that you might want to add, and I'm not sure, and that's from these previous slides I've spoken about, is that I think we have to also think about action and impact. Because we've got interest, concern, and knowledge, but we want to be doing things, don't we? So how do we measure in our science engagement and activities and behaviours that all of these three things, whichever comes first, and maybe they change around, but how do we get that to see what is action and impact so that we can transform our society through science? So it's amazing to see how this report used these 5 different forms of activities and behaviours. So we've spoken about the academic engagement, and they used school learning as a critical space for that. This attraction-based engagement, and we got very low results on that. I'll show you that. But I've just been recently in London, and when I went to museums and I was in Scotland, the museums are full. They're teeming with people. So what is it about our kinds of spaces that are not filling up with people? We need to ask those questions. And that's not to say that London is reflective of Durban or of Joburg. But I think wherever you go in the world where there are amazing museums, aren't they always full? You have to queue outside to get into these museums. So people are still interested in this, even in the age of all of this technology. I've spoken quite a lot about the community-based engagement and how we might think about that. And then this interesting thing about information sharing, which I'll return to, and then we've had a lot of information on the online apps and everything. So this graph is interesting because what you see here, and we've spoken about academic exposure to STEM subjects, attraction-based, you can see that's pretty low. And the blue bar is any kind of engagement. The orange is high engagement. So there's not a lot of engagement in all of these things through science. But what I found very interesting is in the some engagement and even in the high engagement, the S&T information sharing, which you'll see in the data, which is actually about people talking to each other, sharing knowledge with family and friends and colleagues, is as high as the engagement with the online apps. So while we're moving into this technological world and we're all reading our cell phones, and that's our main space of engagement we heard earlier, what to me is fascinating in this report is actually people interacting with each other and sharing knowledge between each other. Personal contacts and relationships is very, very important for science engagement. So I've spoken about the STEM and social science education, and as I said, this was a lot higher than I actually expected when I started to read the report. And I think you would be familiar with the idea that people take maths, biology, and physical sciences, and then geography and history are the subjects. But there's still a concern because a quarter of the population has no exposure to the STEM subjects, and interestingly, a higher level for geography and history, which are really analytical subjects. And science is about analytical thinking. So I think we need to focus on why those subjects are actually getting very low levels of attendance. We also, when we look at education, we've got to be careful because, of course, it's not just that you're getting exposed to education, it's the quality of the teaching, the level of understanding, the application of knowledge, and then, of course, these structural inequality things. Now, this is interesting. I thought it was fascinating on the sites and activities that the report looked at, and this idea of libraries, and we heard earlier that your phone is now a library. But what about the physical built libraries that we have across our country? And what's interesting is that libraries are very prevalent across society. They are built infrastructure. They have resources that we have that are close to people, and there are many of them. But you can see their level of attendance is very low. And I'm going to return back to how we might reconfigure or think about libraries. Let's see in the room who's been in a library in the last month, a physical library that actually has books in it. Anybody? Who wants to put their hands up? Okay, so there's a question about libraries, and I have to be honest, the reason I was standing in a library is it was pouring with rain in Edinburgh, and I ran into the first door I found, and I could not believe it. It was a library, and then I got so captivated by the library, I didn't worry about the storm outside, and I spent hours there. But the point is, yeah, that's the thing. How many of us go into libraries, and what's happened with libraries? Then you can see that there's public science activities, there's museums again, and I've spoken a little bit about that, but again, what's interesting is that while there's a low level of nature spaces, and that's why I think the work has been so clever to think about this environmental lens, botanical gardens, while they're not highly available, they're very highly attended in relation to that. So there's an opportunity. And then obviously, again, these technology centres or exhibitions also seem to be popular. And we've heard the kind of demographic splits that we see in all of our processes around science engagement and the science that we've been talking about. But what's interesting here is that suddenly the urban informal residents have shifted across to the other side. So they're in urban spaces, but they are accessing these science activities. But again, we can think of these sort of structural inequalities and how we change this kind of data. But I think you've seen a lot of it throughout, so I won't overrepresent this. Then I won't focus on the details of these slides, but I did want to get us to think about questions of public participation and community-based engagement, the kinds of things that were asked in the study. So recycling, of course, that's always one that comes up. But it's more about science awareness events, marches, public hearings. It's less about the kinds of things I think I showed you in those images of what we're doing. And I think we need to incorporate that. And then when people participate, how do they communicate? Well, again, here you can see the data that actually shows what I said earlier. Most of the sharing of scientific knowledge is going through family, friends, and colleagues. It's people interacting with each other. Then if I take that same slide onto the next slide, who and how are the public sharing information? Family, friends, and colleagues is the dominant one. And then you relate it to online apps, which is not very high, and you can see how much they're sharing on social media. Actually, people-to-people interaction is really perhaps at the moment where the science, it's swapped around. So how do we create these science engagement activities where people themselves can interact with each other and then they share knowledge through their colleagues and friends? Science engagement begins at home, and I think this is a very important finding of the study, and I think we have to unpack what does it mean that science engagement begins at home. We can take the obvious things of home support for education, encouraging reading, homework, discussing the news, having science, having a parent who's done science. But in my experience, and there are people in this room, we had a conversation, there are people in this room that are really very engaged in scientific learning and knowledge and have done extremely well in science. And what they've spoken about to me in the discussions that we've had is that actually they went into science because they were trying to address a barrier in their lives. They were trying to address a boundary. They were trying to bring about change. So they were in homes where there wasn't a lot of scientific activity, homes where there was a lot of structural inequality. So they were in homes where if you looked at the study, you'd say, yes, that person will never go into science. But there was something in them that said, I'm going to change the world because science is going to be the key to doing that. And there's so many examples of that. And so we've got to think about what does it mean about the home that we can change in the home that gets all of these amazing stars, and they're sitting in the room here with us, who are going to move out of these homes and become the scientists of the future. So how do we invest in science activity at the home and settlement scale? How do families and individuals engage in science activities? And that brought me back to thinking about libraries. And it brought me back to thinking about my own work, because I spend a lot of time in informal settlements. And you can imagine why a child growing up in an informal settlement doesn't have the space. It's so hot, you're battling with so many difficult things. How would you focus on science? But yet those children are playing around this neighborhood, finding all kinds of solutions. I watch them playing, using resources in the settlement. They're doing science, but we're not framing it in that way. And then I was thinking about libraries, because libraries are close by, and with heat and climate change and too much rain and everything getting sodden, wouldn't a library be a wonderful place to escape to? So why are these spaces in our city not becoming a haven, a quiet space, a place of reflection, that we can bring in this kind of science engagement if they are close by to people and we know that there's stresses or pressures in homes where people can't study? So can we think of repurposing or refitting our libraries so that we can overcome some of the ways in which science is not accessible to everyone, and to make these spaces more inclusive? So this is a lot of detail on this slide, and I won't run through, all through the detail on the points. But I think we've spoken about how do we have tuition and public science awareness programs. We've spoken about science communication through media, TV, radio. We saw, and I think radio, we completely underestimate the value of radio in this country. It is still such a powerful means of communicating to people, because often in our research, we ask people how do they know things, and they say it was on the radio. free science events, educational science. I think we've heard a lot about how do we make our science engagement relevant to the lives of people in our society, so that's helping them understand questions that they want to answer. And then this is just a slide of a whole lot of scientists that I work with. This is in the same community. Here we're engaging on a greening program. And to me, these are the scientists. These are our foot soldiers who get out there, and they're called EnviroChamps. Durban has a program of funding local people who work on river rehabilitation, and they go door to door. They engage with people. They share knowledge, and they're the foot soldiers for science. And through the partnership with the university, we're the kind of intermediaries that bring different forms of knowledge to them with their own knowledge, and then they take it out and disseminate it. So again, it's very people-oriented. And in these kinds of spaces, as I showed you, we're connecting indigenous and scientific knowledge. And so here's a story about somebody, the very kind of person we're talking about. This is Zandile Sangweni, and she was very happy for me to tell you her story. She grew up in Ananda, Newtown. She went to school, she did science and maths in her matric, but of course she didn't do very well in those subjects. And so she couldn't access university, but fortunately she got funding to go into a private institution to do a higher certificate again, and from getting 32% for maths in matric, her maths literacy in this program where she got good teaching went up to 74%. So that was striking for me in the first place. And she started to discover she had a keen interest in science. And through her institution, she had never in school ever been to Ushaka Marine World, right in our city. But through her university, she went on a field trip last week, and she was so excited. She was telling me about it, and I thought, this is a perfect story for this conference. Because here you can see she's at Ushaka Marine World. And I said to her, Zandile, what would you say to everybody if you wanted to talk about science engagement and what you experienced on that day? And this is what she said. She said, perfect penguins. Our visit to Ushaka Marine was an eye-opener because we learned about the importance of conservation and the alarming fact that penguins might disappear by 2030. We must protect them. This is from her visit to a science space in Durban. And so I wonder in those three circles, when you read her quote, what is the biggest circle for her? Is it knowledge, interest, or concern? How would you fill those three circles? What's happened to Zandile when she's gone to Ushaka Marine World, finally had that opportunity, and she's just come alive through her engagement in science? What's come first? Her interest, her concern, knowledge? Maybe she got exposed to knowledge, and so she's now interested in penguins, and now she's got concern about it. But you can see that all of those three things are just happening in her single quote that she gave me. And that's what we've got to try and capture and harness, I think, is people's experiences of going into these spaces and what comes alive in them when they engage with science. And so again, a very full slide, but I think our interest in science is about building curiosity, and I think in our country we have enormous curiosity, and that's going to be associated with science awareness and knowledge. But we need to expand the programs that we have. We have a lot of programs, and we need to question if these kinds of science-based activities are still relevant or meaningful to the people that go to. And Zandile's example shows that Ushaka Marine was fantastic for her. And so that space is actually working. We need to think of new kinds of programs and types of engaging content, and we've spoken a lot about that, so I won't stress that. And build on this scientific curiosity and inquiry that is so prevalent in our society. But we also need to address the factors, the structural factors that undermine that. And I was thinking about the fact that it's so important that science begins at home. And I think from my experience in the spaces that I work with, we have to focus on safety and security, because that's often the reason people don't experience science in the way that they should, because science really begins with playing and exploring. And how do we invest in human settlements at homes and homes that are conducive to scientific learning, where very young children and adults too can play and explore their world? And how do we create equity in early childhood education in localized spaces? So nobody's raised the issue of safety and security, but I think that undermines often engagement in science. And what this conference has taught me, I added this from my 2 days with all of you, is that science is about fun. And if any of you were in our group in the university section, it was all about laughter. Okay, it was so much laughter and engagement and fun and so inspiring, and we've got to bring that element of science. Science is about, someone spoke about blowing up the the science lab at school. I once blew up with my students a rugby field that nobody was supposed to walk on because they made volcanoes, and the boys detonated them, and I made a big hole in the rugby field. They will never forget that science of that day, because it was a huge impact on the first team rugby game that Saturday, because the fly-off couldn't kick off from the middle spot. That's what people remember. So how do we make science fun? And so in conclusion, I think we have a strong interest in science. People value science and knowledge. There are these structural factors, as I said, but how do we invest in that, and how do we change that? And I think this point, I'm repeating myself now, is that what are the kinds of metrics that we can use to measure? So maybe that's for the report as we go forward. What other kinds of metrics can we measure? Because we see so much evidence of science in society, and how can we build on that? Environmental interest and concern is very high. So again, I'm sorry, this is my own bias, but I think we can use the environment, and particularly because now everybody's worried about the effects of the weather and all of these things, I really think we can use society-environment relations to really support science engagement by the public. And the other thing I'd like to argue is that we need to engage science. We have to think about science engagement from the specialist production of science, so all the scientists in the room, as we would be called if we were in formal institutions of knowledge production, and how we transfer that knowledge in meaningful ways to others. But equally, we have to invest in the co-production of knowledge and the shared learning, and bring other forms of knowledge back into our space. And that's why our role as intermediaries is so critically important. And that is why universities matter so much in our societies today, because it's the movement of different forms of knowledge, the respect of them. And that's what universities are about. It's about knowledge production and understanding knowledge. And that's what we need to do. So how do we design these activities and support behaviors that inspire people for the societal good? And I spoke about the repurposed libraries as an entry point. Doing science in context, where people are. Could we have traveling science events that go to places like our Gates Foundation testing of innovative technologies? We've brought science to the people, and they've had to respond to it. And so can we do science engagement for society, in addition to science engagement about society and from society, which is what traditional scientific knowledge does? And so I'll leave you with the two questions that the groups are going to work on. What do you think? What types of activities do you think could support and improve science engagement by the public? And what are the enablers and barriers to the way in which societal actors engage with science, and therefore are part of these activities, and therefore change their behaviors? So that's my presentation. Thank you for being so patient for this presentation at this time of the day, because I'm sure you're all tired and a lot is going on. And so I really appreciate you listening to me in this forum. Thank you. And this is all just ideas, and I think you have so much more to add to what we can say about science engagement and activities and practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Any questions, comments?
I have two questions, three actually.
Yes.
Is that okay?
No, you're brilliant at questions.
Thank you. The first question is, since there's a high interest in and a low engagement when it comes to science, and you said the possibility could be due to the lack of infrastructure, right? What sort of an engagement? What sort of engagements are there that could accommodate certain communities with a lack of infrastructure?
So I think that's a very important question, and I think the point I was trying to make is that I think science is happening. If you see the kind of examples I used from my own work, I think science is happening in many ways as we collectively try and address the challenges of our society. All over South Africa, people are collectively coming together to try and address the big challenges we face. But we're not really calling that science engagement. We're not seeing that as a science engagement space. So I'm trying to think about, so I think the thing is that you've got high interest and low levels of engagement. And perhaps it's the way that the study measured the metrics to measure what kinds of engagement. And of course, the study very cleverly used very clear ways in which we say this is a science-based activity, like a museum or a botanical garden or whatever. Those are the kind of traditional ways we think about it. So I think the number would go up, the amount of engagement would go up if we actually also measured all those other forms of science engagement that are actually happening on the ground, because we see so much of that. So I think, one, it's the way we're measuring it. But two, I think in the library is a good example of that, is that they've become lost spaces. So why have we lost so much interest in libraries? And so if that is a science engagement space, or if you think of a museum or a science-based event, there are these structural factors that are stopping people going. But maybe it's also the idea that some of those spaces are not connecting with people and what they're really interested in. But then you saw the King Shark example where it was very inspiring to a person. So I think for me, we have to open up our thinking about what this range of activities could be. And if communities are engaging on the ground in solving problems like we're doing all the time, how could scientists come into those spaces and add value? So we often in our work draw in other scientists to keep helping us solve problems. And so communities on the ground in Durban are constantly getting scientists coming to them, and we bring different forms of knowledge together. And maybe we've got to bring that out more into the open, because it's science in practice. But we're not measuring that, and we're not seeing that as science engagement. And of course, we need investment in that. So what if we invested in learning labs across communities all over our country, where particular, because that's transdisciplinary research, particular problems in those communities are elevated, and then you bring science in for co-engagement to say, well, what could we do about that? So for me, that would be the kind of investment in supporting these coalitions around science. But you've got to invest in that, because in our case, research funds that work, but you've got to have resources to bring everybody together. Just to buy scones and juice for tea, it's not expensive, but you need some resources to bring people together in a good way that you can do that engagement. But I think also the idea about the other spaces, we need to look at them, look at museums, look at the botanical gardens, the environment idea, and make those spaces more active and lively, like Kirstenbosch did with the concerts. You know, okay, that's probably people that can afford to go there, but look how many people go into Kirstenbosch Gardens because of the Sunset concerts, or botanical gardens in Durban, which are more accessible and affordable. People go to music concerts, so you bring music into the spaces where you want people to learn about science. So I think bringing science across other kinds of activities also draws people, and then they can walk around and see the science that you want them to see. So those are just some of the thoughts off the top of my head. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you have. The second question is the study with the scientists from Zurich. Why isn't the study or project fully done in South Africa? Because it's based on South African local communities, and that way they can also inspire the young people in that community. As being a scientist is not only accessible for in other countries, mainly Western countries, but as a South African, you can also be part of.
So they were. That was the amazing thing. So the thing is that the technology is developed. That particular technology was developed at EWAG, which is a water and sanitation technology institution in Switzerland, in Zurich. So they made the technology, then they tested it in a park in Zurich, and they did people's response to it, and it was very easy. Everyone just used it. They didn't ask a lot of questions, and it was fine. The technology worked. Then as part of the Gates Foundation project, they brought that technology to South Africa to test it in our context. So they brought the technology, and then what happened is that all the questions, the real scientific questions and the real issues, and in fact those engineers changed some of that technology because of the scientific input from people that lived in that community. They put on a warning system. They did a whole lot of things to that technology. Those community members also came to the university, to the WASH R&D Center, and engaged with our engineers who were also working on that technology. And so one would hope that there's inspiration. What you really need to do then is to find the people in that community that were so inspired by that work, and find ways to fund them perhaps to come into the university so that they can become the engineers that build that technology so it doesn't have to come from Zurich. I think that's your point, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And that's your last part is kind of part of my last question. How can locals that have developed systems, let's say, maybe they have developed systems that are similar to that one, how can locals that have developed a system that improves the lives of the people in their community, and they don't have those any qualification, engineering or any scientific qualifications, how can they get help from the government and scientists? And I know you mentioned it, but how can they reach? How can they reach out? Because that information is not very, like we talked about earlier. There's not a lot of access to information.
Yeah, so I think that's the critical point, is I think we all know the immense capacity in South Africa of people. And you see it across any spaces you work in. There are architects and engineers working in local spaces. They don't have those degrees, but they are acting in those ways of those fields of knowledge. And that's a big question, is about how do you support those people that you find in communities. And many of them will continue to engage in finding solutions to problems. So they are scientists throughout their lives because they're trying to fix problems in their communities. And I think that the way that we can do that, my view is that through these collaborative, and we've heard a lot in my meeting room about collaboration, bringing actors together. If the state and the universities and citizens work together like we're doing on this early flood warning system in Durban, what you see is that that collective is finding solutions to the problem. And that's where the government needs to come in and start finding solutions. And what makes me very sad is we have a waste management project that was also designed by the community. It was funded by PEP funding from the government for 18 months. It worked exceptionally well because it was designed with engineering, waste management, input from UKZN, but essentially by the community. It got government funding for 18 months. It cleaned up the entire settlement. It changed waste management practices in the settlement. It helped Durban Solid Waste because they could come with their truck and collect all the waste out of the informal settlement. And then, of course, what happened? The funding ended because it's an 18-month funding program. And that, to me, is the tragedy in this country, is that we kickstart so many things, but we don't invest in these things in the long term. And now that project is failing because there's no more funding, and we're desperately trying to find that. But that, for me, there's so many examples of that. So we need long-term investment in this engaged kind of science that will, because then people will come out of it, like you're saying, and move into these other spaces of knowledge. But we've got to commit to it, and we've got to have long-term investment in it. That would be my thoughts.